last talked about Ubisoft's, or Ubisoft, whichever one you prefer to use, Assassin's Creed Shadows, there's been a lot of backlash towards the game. The majority of the game community is upset, and a lot of that revolves around Yasuke.
People so quick to abuse their power do not deserve to keep it.
Now, at first glance, people might react and say, oh my god, it's because Yasuke's black that they're upset. And I would tell you who's watching this video and probably new to all of this, that you're kinda right, but not for the reason that you think. It's easy for people to brush this off as some form of overbearing prejudice against black people, but that's probably what Ubisoft was hoping for and hoping to hide behind in case there's any criticism of their game. If you look back at every Assassin's Creed game, the main playable characters usually fit the demographic of the area or region within the historical story being told. In videos like AKG 29's, where he showcases all the main outfits of all the playable protagonists in the series, you can get an idea of this. And one thing that you'll notice is that for everyone, their ethnicity fits their historical setting. AKG 29 also has a video showing the religion and nationality of every protagonist in Assassin's Creed's games, so you can check this out. You can see his nationality is American for the first one. There's Syrian, Italian, French, and we'll actually get back to this character. Welsh, Adewale from Trini, and here's an interesting thing too. Notice that he is a dark-skinned man of African descent. Usually when you see somebody who is of the lighter shade, they have more European features, they're of European descent. We all descended from Africa, by the way. But anyway, there's a point that I'm gonna make later on in the video, and it's kind of funny, but it's really not funny. But then this is gonna prove to you why this is a problem. There's a bigger problem inside of the problem here that people just aren't seeing, but I'm gonna bring it up, and it's gonna be hilarious to you. Or not. So yeah, it was very interesting to people that an Assassin's Creed game set in feudal Japan isn't using a Japanese man. Despite Yasuke having been brought to Japan as a slave, he wasn't Japanese. Even if you go with the fact that there's barely anything known about him, barring what these Wikipedia sites and articles are doing to change history right after the game was announced and people were calling that out, do you think that it is in poor taste to feature someone who isn't Japanese and looks nothing like the Japanese as a main playable character instead of a Japanese man? Because I can understand why the Japanese or other people would feel that way. And consider Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation, where you play as Aveline, an African-French assassin and the first female protagonist in the series, fighting against Templars to control the city. Now, she was an appropriate choice for her setting and narrative. The decision, though, to place Yasuke in this game, the Shadows game, in contrast, really does feel tone-deaf, especially given the cultural and historical context of feudal Japan. By the way, Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation originally wasn't even a core game. It was more of a DLC that had been since packaged with the Assassin's 3 Remastered. And this highlights even more the misstep in Ubisoft's choice, making the inclusion of Yasuke seem more like a marketing ploy than a thoughtful narrative decision. And the Aveline character does appear later on in the franchise in 2003 Black Flag's game, but only in its expansion pack. But anyway, within that spin-off, you're playing this biracial woman whose father was a wealthy merchant and her mother was African, and she was raised in a wealthy and privileged home in New Orleans by her wealthy father and stepmom, and she wanted to free the slaves. She actually did that in her free time because there was so much injustice around them. Then we have Yasuke, who was a slave, and all I'm thinking is, okay, if you're gonna have black people in a big franchise like this as playable characters or main protagonists, why do they always have to be connected to slavery in some way, shape, or fashion? I mean, seriously. Remember the Trini guy from Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag? Yep, I said I was coming back to that. Yeah, he was a former slave from Trinidad who served as the quartermaster of Black Flag protagonists Edward Kenway on board his ship, the Jackdaw, before joining the Brotherhood of Assassins. You see what I mean? Like, I know that you're trying to stay true to history, and yes, there was slavery back then, but they make it seem often as though every time there's a black character, they always have to have slavery in their narrative some way, shape, or form, as if there are black people that didn't exist around the world that were not slaves. I'll get back to that shortly. And so, why use Yasuke? From my knowledge, this is the first Assassin's Creed game set in Japan, and instead of using a Japanese man, considering how every other character in their setting is from that region, like the Trini guy, because it was in like the setting where that would make sense for him to be there, you use an African man in feudal Japan. And so let me get this straight. Are you going to then use a Japanese man in Assassin's Creed game set in Nigeria in the future? It really doesn't make any sense, and it's very tone-deaf and disrespectful to the Japanese. It's also disrespectful to the African and dark-skinned communities because given what has been going on with the weaponizing of diversity, you're basically setting up other people to be against the black community. Not only did they hijack this opportunity from Japan, and it might not seem like a big deal to people, but trust me, if there was a game set in Uganda or Tanzania or Nigeria and the playable character was white, even if they existed in history somehow, some way, in some form or fashion, people would be rightly upset, especially if it's the only or first type of that game in the setting in this franchise. So not only does Ubisoft bypass the opportunity to feature a male Japanese protagonist, but they also manage to botch key aspects of Japanese culture as well. I get that Assassin's Creed has always woven historical fiction with threads of actual history, probably aiming to retain this element of realism. I get that. Given the reliance that they have, though, on authentic historical settings, you kind of hope for a modicum of respect for the cultures and the settings that they're portraying. I mean, these people use DEI consultant firms or people who claim that they're about diversity and they care about culture and want to make sure that people aren't appropriating it and it's being portrayed properly, but they still can't get it right when it comes to Japanese and Chinese architecture. So what are these consultants doing? Are they too preoccupied by jumping on the trend with Yasuke and ensuring that black characters are integrated into a Japanese context and notice the glaring missteps, like using Chinese architectural styles in feudal Japan? You don't realize how testy this is, but yes, historical Japan, the Chinese and Koreans were enslaved by the Japanese. It's a very touchy subject, and people that I was around within the Chinese community really didn't like Japanese people. I'm not saying this was right, the level of venomous racism they showed towards the Japanese, and even on a personal note, my Japanese friend who had to stay outside when my friend's mom learned that he was Japanese. But anyway, it's wrong. It's obviously wrong for you to show, or anyone to show, that level of hatred towards a Japanese person that had nothing to do with what happened back then. But the Chinese do hold a grudge. Moreover, it's quite problematic when you create a game that inaccurately uses Chinese architectural elements in a supposedly Japanese setting. To the Chinese, it can appear as though the Japanese are appropriating yet another aspect of their culture, even though they weren't the ones responsible for this, but that's how some people would see it. This doesn't just look bad, it exacerbates long-standing tensions and it misrepresents these historical facts. I know that this is based in fantasy, but on one hand, it's acknowledged that Chinese architecture significantly influenced the development of Japanese architecture. But this might be a subtle point lost on many Americans, but Koreans, Chinese, and Japanese people take immense pride in their cultural heritage. What may seem trivial to us holds deep significance for them. But that's only one facet of it. So they decided to put Yasuke as a playable character, which is okay, but I don't think that was the right direction given that this was the first Japanese Assassin's Creed game in the franchise that I know of, and they didn't even find it graceful enough to use a Japanese man, especially given how Asian men are treated in media in the US. I mean, there's so many African countries or other regions where dark-skinned people are the majority, and there are rich stories to be told from historical figures in those times when there were empires and interwoven politics. But no, it's important that we have the representation of a dark-skinned man who had been a slave. Why is it that in media, when they're trying to be inclusive with dark-skinned people of African descent, they always have to be tied to slavery? In some way. Like, I know I said this already, but it really gets on my freaking nerves. It's almost synonymous at this point with black people. Even black individuals who were never slaves are often looked at as inferior because of how they're portrayed in media as being oppressed and victimized. This portrayal actually degrades their existence in real life and can make dark-skinned children in places like the US think that that's how they should see the world because that's how the world's always going to see them. It doesn't matter that, oh my god, yes, he's a samurai and he's beating up all the Japanese people. No, but it's tied to him being a slave. It's always that in the entire franchise. The only black characters that you get to play as, I may be wrong, but the only protagonists that I know of, they're always tied to slavery. The other issue that people are finding is with the option for romance with Yasuke. Now, I'm going to play devil's advocate here because I want to start by saying I don't really necessarily have a dog in this fight, whatever. But playing devil's advocate, if these people are pushing that Yasuke really existed, right? Because people are saying that, yes, he was real and he actually was a samurai. Do you think it's then respectful to portray him or give people the option to make him gay when you don't know if he necessarily was or not? I know people might ask, well, then why is the default straight? Well, simply put, because the default is straight. The vast majority of the world is straight. And as far as it goes within the animal kingdom, the vast majority is straight. Even if you're going to use the sex change, the fish and the reptiles or amphibians that change their sex, they usually change their sex so that they can mate in a same-sex environment. That's usually what prompts that to happen, which means that they are still straight. And I know I can feel some of you puffing up your chest right now and getting angry. It sounds very cynical, but to be honest, I doubt in feudal Japan it would have been the norm or so easily received if a character was openly gay. So you put a black man in a role with Japanese culture that people aren't even really sure he had, and you give him and the Japanese woman the option to play as gay characters. People might not know this, and I know that this isn't necessarily right, but based on a historical representation of how straight black men have been portrayed in media or vilified or made to look either weak or extremely violent, black men don't necessarily appreciate this. Now, I understand from one perspective you can say that it doesn't matter because you can opt out of the romances, or it's only down to the players and you can enact whatever fantasy or fanfiction you have in your head. Games like Mass Effect are different because it's an alien setting and they're not real people or based on supposed real people. But if you're pushing that Yasuke was real despite the very little information we have about him, introducing an option to make him gay without any historical evidence can be seen as speculative and potentially inaccurate. If anything, I think it would be more respectful to take out romance as an option entirely. Before someone counters with, oh, so you think making someone gay is disrespectful? I would venture yes, if there's no historical evidence to support such a claim. Let's say that we had a historical character who was gay, and then you give people the option to depict them as straight. While this might seem like nothing, and I personally don't really find an issue with it either way, I do imagine the gay community, to them, it would be seen as disrespectful. Maybe many of them will say they don't care, but there are people who do care about these things, particularly people from a demographic or place where that is not the norm. The African and Black communities, like any other cultural groups, have their own set of values, histories, and experiences. So representing a revered historical figure in a way that doesn't really align with cultural narratives or sensitivities can be seen as disrespectful. Historically marginalized communities often face these challenges with representation in the media already. Adding speculative elements to a historical figure's life can just further perpetuate these misunderstandings and these stereotypes rather than honor the complexity and richness of their true history. If Yasuke existed and had a documented life, as people seem to be pretending that he did, then would it not be respectful to portray his life as accurately as possible based on available evidence? It's like filling in the blanks for people that you have little evidence about, but you're staunch and willing to die on the hill of them having existed. Then when you don't have enough evidence, you add in things like, oh, they sacrificed people and wore their skin, or they ate the legs off of puppy dogs.
Yes, that is what I mean, except instead of maize, I mean people, and instead of leave out, I mean ritually flay them and wear their skin inside out.
What would the gods who protect us want that?
Yes, thank you, gods. We want to wear some human flayed skin for you.
Even though all of that exists within the realms of fantasy, if these were people that you believe actually existed, I could understand how people would see that it would be a bit disrespectful. Also, it's no secret that speculating about Yasuke's sexual orientation without any historical basis can be seen as projecting modern views and preferences onto a historical figure, supposedly. And this kind of speculation can also be seen as an erasure of Yasuke's actual lived experiences and contributions, reducing a complex historical figure to a modern character trope. The portrayal of historical figures in media can significantly influence public perception and understanding of history. So when you introduce these fictionalized elements, especially about sensitive topics like a person's identity, it can lead to the skewed or oversimplified view of history. Now, yes, I know that people are allowed to take creative liberties, but the people who are being asked to spend their money on these products have the right to criticize them as well. It's one thing if you're making a fan fiction on the internet like I do, which gets people very angry for some strange projected reason, but it's entirely different to embed these creative choices into a major franchise. In Baldur's Gate, you can do whatever you want because none of these people exist. If there is a historically gay character, or let's say there is enough evidence that he was actually gay, I imagine it would be very disrespectful to place him in a straight setting, or give people the option to play him as straight. Now, it is just a game, I understand, but the same people who were saying that this shouldn't be an issue would be completely livid if they were to take a historically gay character and give them the option to make them straight. It's either Yasuke was real or not. If he was actually real and he had those achievements, I think it would be more respectful to him and members of his community to focus on those achievements. Not everybody is pansexual throughout history. The openness of orientation that we have now in our society did not exist in a lot of those regions and settings. And oh my god, I know this is gonna twist some people into a knot, but much of the modern expression of queerness is shaped not only by culture, but also by societal influences. There are people changing their gender and orientation every week because it's trending or they want to have different experiences. But it doesn't necessarily mean that every woman who claims that they like women is legitimately gay. Especially when they're like, you know what, it's cool to be gay, when gay people, actual gay people, don't have a choice. I know that that is a whole other broader topic and complex issue to discuss, and I know it's gonna get some people upset, although I don't understand why it would make them upset, but I'm coming at it from the angle of understanding why some people would be turned off by that kind of portrayal. Now let me reiterate and also clarify, not turned off by gay people.
That's not what I said.
Because I know people like to twist my words. That's not what I mean. I mean turned off by the obvious marketing ploy and tokenization of marginalized communities or minority communities. And considering how video games and media often tokenize minority communities, the situation becomes kind of problematic. When these groups are featured in leading roles, there's often a dual attempt to showcase diversity while at the same time portraying these characters with specific sexual identities, which can appear very disingenuous and kind of like an exploitation of diversity for a broader appeal or for money's sake. I've talked about this with dark-skinned or black women leads. I like how people will twist my words and say, oh, I don't like gay people, which makes no sense given my history and what is out there on the internet for everyone to see if you only take a little bit of time to freaking click. Throw away the fact that I've shipped multiple gay characters and couples, but go off, I guess. That being said, I'm not going to ignore what is very obviously tokenizing and making characters gay just for the sake of them being gay, and not because they actually care to tell gay stories. Again, the examples that I can throw off the top of my head that are organic gay couples that feel like real couples and real people are Mickey and Ian from Shameless, The Last of Us, that married couple, Bill and Frank, Our Flag Means Death, Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet. Now I know you're probably saying around now, well, but Blackbeard was a historical figure and so was Stede Bonnet, and we don't know for certain if they were gay, and you like that show. No, we don't know for certain if they were gay. However, there's some evidence suggesting that Blackbeard might have been, or at the very least had queer tendencies. It's known that during that era, with men confined on ships for extended periods and under the constant threat of death, intimate relationships among pirates were not uncommon. Or I should say they weren't unheard of. Apparently there's a joke about Navy men and it came from somewhere. Now this isn't a viable source. I've seen this documentation everywhere. I'll get into that later. But as this post says, same-sex relationships were highly stigmatized on land and illegal in most places. Piracy, however, was known for rejecting societal standards and expectations. Some pirates went as far as baptisms in seawater, new names, and completely leaving behind their past identities. Queer relationships at sea were not uncommon during the golden era of piracy in the 1650 to 1730s. It is said that relations between men was often encouraged. At the time, men on ship knew more about their crewmates than even their wives and children on land. This drew in a lot of queer men to piracy. Pirates had their own form of civil union called maquillotage. These unions could range in meaning, fraternal, platonic, romantic, etc., but were respected among most pirate crews. A partner was called your matelot, which can be interpreted as bunkmate. If one partner died, their matelot would have ownership of all their possessions. Matlos could take punishments for each other, and most fought side by side. Now, it's important to approach this with a grain of salt, as our primary comparisons come from highly controlled same-sex environments like prisons or the military, which are generally cut off from broader society. The historical records on the prevalence of homosexuality are actually very scant. However, it is conceivable that men who felt like they could not openly engage in same-sex relationships in mainstream society might have been inclined to pursue careers in environments like piracy, where they predominantly were surrounded by other dudes and where such relationships might have faced less stigma if they were exposed. I mean, I'm sure if you see two guys bucking below deck, you're like, I don't want to know, but whatever floats your boat, literally, kind of. Even still, it doesn't mean that most pirates were gay. This still wouldn't be an openly accepted thing in cultured society. However, pirates, I imagine, would go around seeing all sorts of things and getting into all sorts of adventures with drugs and drinking. If there are no women on the ship, just like men in jail, men are going to find a way to get off, or they're going to actually probably fall in love with someone for their personality and not based on what they have between their legs. That happens.
You friggin' gays!
If you're in a situation where you have nothing else, then you're going to make do with what you have. Does it make them gay, though, the people who are just doing that, not specifically falling in love with someone, but just dealing with it on a physical level? I don't know. Do men in jail who have no women around and choose the most feminine-looking one to use as a substitute count as gay people? Do those men who otherwise, in any other setting, would not have opted to sleep with a man who identifies as gay? There are many men who said that they were taking advantage of when they were little, and they strictly like women. So does that make them gay because they had that experience with a male figure who took advantage of them? Many men will tell you that when they get out of jail, they did what they had to do in there, but that doesn't make them gay. Pirates have a free lifestyle, and so it makes sense that they would defy cultural norms and experience absolutely everything because that's the kind of life they lived, so they're more open to things. Just like now, where we're extremely privileged to be living in the United States, and we're idle and have more food than we know what to do with, it's easy to fall into a habit of experiencing absolutely everything because, especially since we don't really need to have children right now or populate the world. And the funny thing about all of this is that there's actually more documentation of Blackbeard than there is of Yasuke. I'm sorry. But being a pirate and being gay, even openly so, is way more believable than an African slave man in feudal Japan being gay or openly so. Furthermore, Taika Waititi, who was the showrunner or the guy who produces shows like Black Flag, Our Flag Means Death, and Time Bandits, which is a very good show. I loved Our Flag Means Death as well. He always parodies situations with his shows, so it's obvious to many that watch these shows not to take anything in them seriously. So, I don't know. Shoot me. Now, the Pink News article at the time actually claimed that according to information shared about the game by Ubisoft Quebec, NPCs will be romanceable depending on the character the player chooses, meaning that certain characters will only be attracted to either Naoi or Yasuke. Those options will include same-sex NPCs for both characters, as well as platonic relationships for those not looking for anything overtly sexual. Rumors that the characters would be queer in some way were shared by the development studio in a blog post in May, which said Nawa and Yasuke's personalities lead them to have different relationships and rapport with other characters, and they don't always feel the same way about people. Romantically, the Assassin's Creed Shadows protagonists will also attract and be attracted to different types of people. Through the pair, players will get to experience a multitude of relationships. Nawa and Yasuke's definitive sexuality will ultimately be up to the player depending on who they romance, with the option being left open for a more authentic role-playing experience. I mean, okay, I guess, now is whatever. I personally do not see a problem with this from a role-playing point of view because you're given an option. I can imagine also that people would be thinking in their heads as they're playing the game, if they're gay and they're experiencing things through the character, they're playing as the character, and so it would make them curious as to how that would play out in this kind of setting. But I can understand why some people would not be okay with there even being an option with Yasuke specifically. I imagine it if you're playing as Yasuke and you want to identify him as a woman and as you're playing him, that could be done without the game having it built into the mechanics, regardless. But when I'm playing male characters in video games and the story is being told and they have a romance with a woman, in that moment, I am the male character, and so I'm experiencing what he would experience, like we get with Cloud in Final Fantasy. They claim that they had this in the previous entry for Valhalla and Odyssey. I don't know, man. I didn't think Assassin's Creed was one of those franchises that would go the romantic route in general, but here we are. It definitely is an interesting conversation to have, but on to the next thing. Now, another issue that the fans are having based on what is stated here in Fandom Wire is that, as it says here, is that a gaming franchise that predominantly focuses on historical settings seems to have messed up the eras. The article says the game is said to be in 1579 during the Sengoku period of feudal Japan. Unfortunately, it seemingly uses references from the wrong historical eras, where people haven't hesitated to bring up. Some eagle-eyed fans noticed that some of the concept art for the shadows appeared to directly ripped from real-life photographs and artworks. While initially accused of stealing or copy-pasting these, it looks like the team used the photo bashing technique, which is commonly used in concept art to get across ideas quickly. However, further problems arose when people realized that the photo bashed images weren't even accurate to the period the game takes place in. The photographs and artworks are from the Meiji 1868 to 1912 and Taisho 1912 to 1925 periods rather than the Sengoku period. Now, we have people saying that the Japanese should not be offended because the concept art is just an idea of how the game should look, and this is not the first game to have done it. First of all, people who usually get offended over everything, telling the Japanese that they shouldn't be offended over something that has to do with their cultural identity is just rich. However, I understand though that when the game comes under scrutiny for pissing off several communities all at once, it's going to be open to more scrutiny and make people see things they probably weren't aware of because they're now looking.
I see it. I can see it.
The article goes on saying that while photo bashing is a legitimate technique, the use of incorrect references can still hurt the game's authenticity, especially when it's something that each entry in the franchise attempts to get right. They point out other inaccuracies that people might see as small, but with the Japanese being such a proud culture, it makes sense that they would be upset over things like this. For example, if someone took my country's flag and there was a slight border around it where there hadn't been before, and they're marketing this to people who are going to be learning about my culture, widespread, worldwide, whatever, and you can see that, you know, what flag it is, even though it might seem like a little thing to outsiders, it would be a big deal to me and other people from my country because it's a misrepresentation of what our flag actually looks like. And even though you might be like, it's just a little border around it, that's not what the flag looks like. We have a flag. Every single person, you'll know what nationality we are because if we're from that country, we have a flag in our house somewhere. It's like a running gag. People who are claiming that the Japanese are nitpicking are actually very disrespectful because I guarantee you, if you drew an original character and somebody got one detail on it wrong, you'd be pissing yourself. And for this reason, a lot of people wouldn't even want others drawing their original characters. For a lot of people playing these Assassin's Creed games, that's the only immersion they're going to get into history. Most people don't even like history. It's not that interesting overall. But if they like video games, it's a way to port themselves into this world and learn about it. If that is the purpose of the Assassin's Creed franchise games, to have some creative liberties but to maintain that the history and setting are correct, then you need to make sure that it's actually correct. Now here's where things get interesting. On Twitter and on the Assassin's Creed page, they put out a notice for the Japanese community, and it says this: "To our esteemed Japanese community, a message from the Assassin's Creed Shadows development team. First, we want to express our heartfelt thanks for all your support for the Assassin's Creed series, which now has its own history spanning almost 20 years. Over this time, we have explored various settings, time periods, and characters, from an assassin during the Third Crusade to a Viking in the 9th century England, and countless more. For many of our team, creating an Assassin's Creed game set in feudal Japan has been a long-cherished dream. Since the announcement of Assassin's Creed Shadows, we have received many positive reactions, but also some criticism, including from you, our Japanese players. We share your passion for history and deeply respect your care for the historical and cultural integrity of your rich heritage. We would like to address a few points to clarify our intentions in creative decisions.
Let's hear it. Let's hear it.
Overall authenticity efforts. We have put a significant effort into ensuring an immersive and respectful representation of feudal Japan. However, our intention has never been to present any of our Assassin's Creed games, including Assassin's Creed Shadows, as factual representations of history or historical characters. Instead, we aim to spark curiosity and encourage players to explore and learn more about the historical settings we get inspired by. Assassin's Creed Shadows is first and foremost designed to be an entertaining video game that tells a compelling historical fiction set in feudal Japan. Our team extensively collaborated with external consultants, historians, researchers, and internal teams at Ubisoft Japan to inform our creative choices. Despite these sustained efforts, we acknowledge that some elements in our promotional materials have caused concern within the Japanese community. For this, we sincerely apologize. All game footage presented so far is in development, and the game will keep evolving until launch. Based on the constructive criticism we've received, we will continue our efforts until we put this game into your hands and beyond. We also want to clarify that while we have been consulting with many people throughout the development process, they are in no way responsible for the decisions that are taken by the creative teams in the interests of gameplay and entertainment. Consequently, we respectfully request that any criticism not be directed at our collaborators, both internal and external. What, you mean like Sweet Baby? I don't even know if they are, but kind of sounds like what they're referring to. But anyways, creative liberties and historical inspirations. While we strive for authenticity in everything that we do, Assassin's Creed games are works of fiction, inspired by real historical events and figures. From its inception, the series has taken creative license and incorporated fantasy elements to craft engaging and immersive experiences. The representation of Yasuke in our game is an illustration of this. His unique and mysterious life made him an ideal candidate to tell an Assassin's Creed story with a setting of feudal Japan as a backdrop. While Yasuke is depicted as a samurai in Assassin's Creed Shadows, we acknowledge that this is a matter of debate and discussion. We have woven this carefully into our narrative and with our other lead character, the Japanese shinobi Nao, who is equally important in the game. Our dual protagonists provide players with different gameplay styles. We greatly value your feedback and encourage you to continue sharing your thoughts respectfully. While we understand that meeting everyone's expectations is different, we sincerely hope that when Assassin's Creed Shadows launches on November 15, players in Japan and around the world will appreciate the dedication, effort, and passion we have poured into it. The Assassin's Creed Shadows development team. So notice that they say this: while we strive for authenticity in everything that we do, Assassin's Creed games are works of fiction inspired by real historical events and figures. From its inception, the series has taken creative license and incorporated fantasy elements to craft engaging and immersive experiences. The representation of Yasuke in our game is an illustration of this. His unique and mysterious life made him an ideal candidate to tell an Assassin's Creed story with a setting of feudal Japan as a backdrop. If that's the case, then why is everyone bending over backwards to change history for the sake of Yasuke? Now, while I'm not entirely sure if Assassin's Creed, the franchise, if they're behind the sudden changes to all these articles, and I only assume that the marketing team or the actual owners of the franchise had something to do with it based on what happened with the Warhammer situation and the Star Wars situation with Acolyte, they should have come out with this much sooner and very clearly. Regardless of whether or not you believe that Yasuke existed, some people don't believe Jesus existed either, you know, that's up for debate as well. Regardless of whether or not you believe he was an actual samurai or a retainer, there still remain two very big issues. First, your game is set in feudal Japan. Instead of taking from a pool of Japanese male characters, you chose someone who was not of Japanese descent for the first Japanese game in a really big franchise where every other character mostly is represented in their region for their nationality. Second, you shoehorned in a black character specifically because he was black. I'm not going to pussyfoot around. I'm going to just say what it is because I know what it is. Instead of making a game based in one of the African countries or other regions where you have actually predominant black characters, where there was slavery as well as, you know, a host of other political issues, etc., you set it in feudal Japan. You basically told the Japanese men, shut the hell up and deal with it. You put out a game at a time where cultural identity and culture wars are at an all-time high and decided to portray a big African guy who was a victim and enslaved chopping down Japanese people. This is especially sensitive given that there are already tensions between the Asian community and black community in America and also in parts of Asia. Let me ask you something. If there had never been an Assassin's Creed game set in a predominantly black region, and when I say black, I don't mean necessarily black American, I mean people with darker skin. And then the first one that you get set in that region, let's say Uganda, you make the playable character, especially the dude, white, or any other ethnicity that was enslaved by the Ugandan people, hypothetically speaking, right? And then you have that person rising to power, learning the natives' ways and going to war, chopping up all these Ugandan men and showing how much better he is than them at their own game of being a warrior. How do you think that would be received? Really think now. It's a really good exercise to do when you're offended over something. Imagine if it was flipped. Would you still be offended? If the answer is that it wouldn't offend you at all, then you're a hypocrite. If you don't mind when either is done, then I'll give you that. And your feeling that we're all crazy and making a big deal out of nothing is warranted. But if you wouldn't want a majority dark skin setting in an Assassin's Creed franchise, having a white character or someone of another ethnicity being the protagonist in a setting where he has to fight and subdue the native demographic, then I imagine you wouldn't want that for the Japanese either. By itself, this might not seem like a big deal to people, but given what people are doing with Japanese culture and constantly trying to change it, undermine it, or mock it, coupled with how some Asian people are treated in the USA, I don't know. I could be wrong. It just did not seem like the right move on Ubisoft's part. Yes, I'm aware that there are other works about Yasuke. Yes, I'm aware that there are other video games where they use other ethnicities in feudal Japan, but I'm not talking about those. Let's not do the whataboutism thing. I'm talking about Assassin's Creed because that's what everyone's talking about right now. That's the thing that the Japanese are taking issue with. If you make a one-off game about Yasuke, which I'm guessing that there already exists something like that, I might be wrong. I know there's an anime of it. I actually do want to watch that. Then whatever. But next to a long list of games in the franchise that have a specific pattern of playable characters based on their region demographic and ethnicity fitting, it seems very out of place. And I'm sorry, a bit like tokenism to do this with feudal Japan when you could have used a Japanese man complemented by the Japanese woman. I would love to see them do an Assassin's Creed game set in an African country or in a region with very dark-skinned individuals. Instead of doing that, with all the rich stories and historical context that Africa has, these gaming companies, as well as media companies like Disney, seem to avoid African countries like the plague. And it begs the question, why? Why do Hollywood and elite companies choose to always take Africans or African descendants out of their native areas and force them into other cultures? Is it because they're perpetuating what their ancestors did by bringing Africans from their native areas, and that's the only way they can see dark-skinned people playing a role? Because just like you can take consultants about certain cultures and history based on those regions, I imagine you can do the same for African scholars or people who have traveled to Africa and lived in those countries or in those tribes or those rich cities, or actual historians to help you actually make a game set in an African country with dark-skinned individuals. I'm sorry, is that not marketable enough for you, Ubisoft? Disney? Interesting. If the gaming studios, marketing teams, and articles weren't so hateful when it comes to racial rhetoric, I don't think this would have been as big a deal as people are making it. It probably still would have been to the Japanese, but I don't think it would have been as big of a deal for the gaming community. But in light of everything that is piled up in this sphere over the coming years, this just seems like another spoke in the wheel, which is why people, including the black community, are annoyed. And I'm not talking about the people who are reading on Twitter and who reactively say that everything is racist when it has nothing to do with race also. I'm talking about actual real people who look into these issues and realize what is actually happening and how this is breaking down the substance in our media and communities, like what they tried to do with Cleopatra.
I remember my grandmother saying to me, I don't care what they tell you in school, Cleopatra was black.
It shouldn't be about somebody being black and putting them in there because they're black. It shouldn't be about making someone evil just because they're male and white. It should be about telling stories about interesting people whose epidermis just happens to be a certain color. I understand that in some stories, narratively, the skin color or ethnicity definitely plays a big part, but people can see right through the inauthenticity of the studios when they do things like this. It makes it seem as though black people have no culture, or have to always be injected into somebody else's culture, or having been a slave or oppressed, only to rise up and be violent against those people. That is the only way that black people seem to be popularly portrayed, particularly black men, by the way. Either that, or they're emasculated in some way, shape, or fashion. In the previous video, I mocked the term benign sexism, and a lot of people were claiming that it could actually be a thing. Like, you don't know you're being sexist, and you're being nice, but you're kind of sexist, which I still don't agree with because it makes no sense to me. But if you're going with that logic, then I imagine the situation with Yasuke and Ubisoft would fall into the category of benign racism. I understand if some people will perk their ears up and think that's the weirdest thing that they've ever heard, but it's simply people doing something nice for a minority and claiming that it's a good thing, but they're actually being racist by doing so because you're not shining the person in a good light, or you're not raiding the freaking room, or you're putting a target on their back. But let's have a discussion, because I'm open to hearing other perspectives, because I will agree that there are many different perspectives to be had, and I can't possibly have covered every single perspective because that's impossible. I could also be completely wrong about everything, so I'm open to that as well.